You're firing me? Just like that? Jalen's voice was steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. CEO Calloway barely looked up. Jalen Carter pulled into Westwood Hills, a quiet, upper-class neighborhood where the lawns were manicured to perfection and every driveway had a luxury car parked in front. He knew this route like the back of his hand. He had been delivering for TrackDrop couriers for over 2 years now. As he rolled to a stop in front of 244, Oak Ridge Lane, he grabbed a small brown package from the passenger seat and scanned the barcode with his handheld device. Delivered, flashed on the screen, confirming the drop-off. Routine. Simple. Just another stop in a long day. Jalen stepped out of the van, adjusting his cap as he made his way up the stone pathway. The house was large, with ivy crawling up its brick walls, giving it an old-world charm. He placed the package neatly at the center of the porch, snapped a confirmation photo, and turned to leave. That's when he heard it. "Hey! What are you doing?" Jalen turned, startled. A woman stood in the doorway, Mrs. Wilkins, a silver-haired, stern-faced woman in her late 60s. She clutched her phone tightly, her expression sharp with suspicion. Jalen forced a polite smile. "Just dropping off your package, ma'am. You should have it now." She didn't respond. Instead, her eyes flicked to his uniform, then back to the package. "You sure about that?" Jalen frowned. "Yes, ma'am. You can check your tracking." She cut him off. "I don't trust these delivery services. I've seen stories. Packages disappearing, drivers stealing them." Jalen felt his stomach tighten. This again. It wasn't the first time a customer had treated him with distrust, but it never got easier. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he said, keeping his voice calm. He knew better than to escalate things. Mrs. Wilkins didn't move. She raised her phone, and before he realized what was happening, she snapped a photo of him. Jalen took a deep breath. "Have a good day, ma'am." Without waiting for another word, he turned and walked back to his van. As he pulled away, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He had done everything by the book, yet he knew, somehow, this wasn't over. What could possibly go wrong for someone who follows every rule? The next morning, Jalen walked into TrackDrop couriers as usual, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. He greeted a few co-workers, grabbed his route sheet, and was about to head out when his manager's voice called from across the room. "Jalen. In my office. Now." Jalen frowned. Why the urgency? He had never been called in first thing in the morning before. He made his way through the narrow hallway to Mr. Davenport's office, knocking lightly before stepping inside. Davenport, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a permanent look of stress, was sitting behind his desk. His arms were crossed, and his mouth was pressed into a firm line. That's when Jalen noticed the second man in the room, Grant Calloway, the CEO of TrackDrop Couriers. The CEO? Here. A wave of unease settled over Jalen. "Have a seat," Davenport said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Jalen sat cautiously. Calloway didn't speak, just leaned back with his hands clasped, watching. Davenport slid a printed email across the desk. "We got a complaint about you." Jalen picked up the paper and read it. "I witnessed one of your delivery drivers lingering near my porch after delivering my package. I believe he was attempting to steal it. This is unacceptable behavior, and I hope TrackDrop takes immediate action. Mrs. Wilkins." Jalen felt his jaw tighten. He looked up. "That's not what happened." Calloway's voice was smooth but cold. "Are you saying the customer is lying?" "Yes. I delivered the package, took the proof photo, and left. I didn't linger." Davenport sighed. "Jalen, I've known you for a while now. You've been a great employee. But Calloway's right, we can't afford bad press." Jalen's grip on the paper tightened. "So, that's it? One complaint, no investigation, and I'm out. Calloway shrugged. We have a zero-tolerance policy. Customers are the backbone of this company, and if they don't trust us, we lose business. Jalen shook his head in disbelief. But I did nothing wrong. Check the delivery logs, the GPS, heck, the security cameras. Calloway's expression didn't change. We don't have time for that. Davenport looked genuinely regretful, but his hands were tied. Effective immediately, you're terminated. Jalen sat there, stunned. He had always followed the rules. Always been professional. Yet none of it mattered. Security was called in to escort him out. As Jalen walked through the warehouse, past the co-workers he had once laughed with, a sinking realization settled in his chest. His word meant nothing. How can you defend yourself when no one wants to hear the truth? Across town, Officer Brian Hayes adjusted the strap of his bulletproof vest as he sat in his patrol car, reviewing footage from his K-9 partner, Max. Max, a well-trained German shepherd, wasn't just a loyal police dog, he was a walking security camera. His vest was equipped with a high-definition body cam, recording everything during their patrols. It was part of a new initiative the department had introduced to increase transparency. That morning, Officer Hayes and Max had been patrolling Westwood Hills, responding to a separate incident. It was routine, checking in on a suspicious person call, which turned out to be nothing. But as Hayes reviewed the footage later, something else caught his attention. Jalen Carter. The footage showed Jalen pulling up to 244, Oak Ridge Lane, stepping out of his delivery van, and carefully placing a package on the porch. Then, just as he turned to leave, the camera caught something unexpected. Mrs. Wilkins opening the door, waiting, then picking up the package herself. That wasn't what bothered Hayes the most. It was what happened next. A few minutes later, Mrs. Wilkins returned to her porch, this time with an empty box. She placed it near the bushes and pulled out her phone. Her mouth moved, and the footage captured every word. I'd like to report a suspicious delivery driver. I think he was trying to steal my package. Hayes froze. His instincts told him this wasn't just an old woman being forgetful. She had staged it. Max let out a low growl, almost as if he sensed something was wrong. Hayes absent-mindedly scratched the dog's ear as he rewound the footage and played it again. There was no theft. No hesitation. Jalen had done nothing wrong. Hayes narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a false accusation. And Jalen Carter had been fired over it. Hayes clenched his jaw. Not on my watch. With a sharp whistle, he signaled to Max, come on, boy. We've got work to do. He grabbed his keys and started the engine. It was time to pay TrackDrop a visit. Could an unexpected witness prove Jalen's innocence? Jalen sat on the curb outside TrackDrop Couriers, his work badge still clutched in his hand. He had tried calling his brother, Malik, for advice, but the call went straight to voicemail. What was he supposed to do now? He had bills to pay. His rent was due in 2 weeks. And now, because of one false accusation, he had nothing. As frustration bubbled in his chest, he barely noticed the black and white police cruiser pulling up to the curb. When the door opened, a tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, followed by a large German shepherd on a leash. Jalen Carter, the officer asked, his voice firm but not unfriendly. Jalen tensed. He had done nothing wrong, but in his experience, that didn't always matter. He stood slowly. Yeah, that's me. I'm Officer Brian Hayes. This is my K-9 partner, Max. He gestured to the dog, who sat attentively at his side, tail flicking slightly. Jalen glanced between them, confused. Is something wrong? Officer Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his vest and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it around to face Jalen. You recognize this? Jalen squinted at the video. His breath caught. It was him, delivering the package at 244, Oak Ridge Lane. He watched himself step onto the porch, set the box down, and leave. Then the footage shifted, Mrs. Wilkins reappeared, placing an empty box near the bushes, then calling TrackDrop. Jalen's fists clenched. "She set me up." Officer Hayes nodded. Max's body cam caught everything. For the first time in hours, Jalen felt a flicker of hope. Officer Hayes locked eyes with him. "I don't know what happened in there," he nodded toward TrackDrop's office, "but I'm guessing they didn't bother to hear you out." Jalen exhaled sharply. "Not even for a second." Hayes slid the tablet back into his vest. "Then let's go fix that." Jalen hesitated. "Wait. You're coming with me?" Hayes smirked. "You bet. And so is Max." Jalen looked down at the K9, who let out a low, approving woof. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't over yet. Would TrackDrop be willing to listen to the truth, or was their decision final? Jalen walked back into TrackDrop Couriers, his heart pounding. This time, he wasn't alone. Officer Hayes strode beside him, his K9 partner Max keeping pace. The presence of a uniformed officer and a trained police dog turned heads in the office. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Why is a cop here? Is Jalen in trouble? Wait, that's a K9. This must be serious." Jalen ignored the murmurs and followed Hayes straight to Davenport's office. The door was open, and inside, Grant Calloway, the CEO, was still there, reviewing paperwork. Davenport looked up, startled. "Jalen, I told you." Hayes cut him off, flashing his badge. "Officer Brian Hayes, K9 Unit. I need to speak with both of you. Now." Calloway raised an eyebrow but leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "What's this about?" Without a word, Hayes pulled out his tablet and tapped the screen. The body cam footage played, and for the first time, both men saw the truth. Jalen folded his arms, watching as their expressions changed. Mrs. Wilkins' voice came through loud and clear. "I'd like to report a suspicious delivery driver. I think he was trying to steal my package." Then, the footage exposed her deception, placing the empty box outside, waiting a few minutes, then making the false call. Davenport's face paled. Calloway's usual calm expression tightened. When the video ended, silence filled the room. Jalen spoke first. "So, let me get this straight. One complaint, no investigation, and you fire me?" His voice was steady, but the frustration was undeniable. "But when I bring proof that I was set up, now you listen." Davenport shifted uncomfortably. "Jalen, we..." "No," Jalen said sharply. "You didn't even check. You didn't care." Calloway exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Look, Carter, we acted on what we had at the time." Officer Hayes scoffed. "You had security footage. GPS logs. Delivery records. You just didn't bother." Max let out a low growl, almost as if agreeing. The tension in the room thickened. Calloway straightened his tie. "All right. We'll discuss this." Jalen narrowed his eyes. That wasn't good enough. Would TrackDrop do the right thing, or were they just covering themselves? Jalen crossed his arms, waiting for Calloway to say what he already knew was coming. The CEO leaned forward, his voice carefully measured. "Look, Carter, this is obviously a misunderstanding." Jalen clenched his jaw. A misunderstanding? He had lost his job, his reputation tarnished, and they wanted to act like it was just a clerical error. "We're willing to reinstate your position immediately," Calloway continued. "Same pay, same route, no questions asked." Jalen could feel Officer Hayes stiffen beside him. Even Max, the K9, let out a small huff. Hayes tilted his head. "That's it?" Calloway arched an eyebrow. "What else would you expect, officer. Hayes folded his arms. Let's start with an apology. Davenport, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. We regret the hasty decision. Jalen let out a humorless chuckle. Hasty? That's what you call it? He leaned forward. You didn't even give me a chance to explain before dragging me out of here like a criminal. Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. We can't change what happened, Carter, but we're offering you your job back. Jalen stared at him. And what about her? Davenport blinked. Who? Mrs. Wilkins. The woman who lied and got me fired. Jalen's voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Is she going to be held accountable? Calloway shifted in his seat. That's not our jurisdiction. Jalen turned to Officer Hayes, who nodded. Actually, it is mine. Calloway's expression darkened. What exactly are you suggesting, officer? Hayes smirked. Filing a false police report is a criminal offense. If Jalen wants to press charges, I'll personally make sure Mrs. Wilkins is investigated. For the first time, Calloway looked uneasy. That seems unnecessary. Jalen shook his head. No, what's unnecessary is how quickly you threw me away over one complaint, but now you expect me to just walk back in here like nothing happened. Davenport cleared his throat. Look, Carter, we value you as an employee. That's why we want you back. Jalen raised an eyebrow. Do you? Or do you just not want a lawsuit? The silence that followed was all the answer he needed. Jalen has a choice, take back his job or fight for something bigger. What will he do? Jalen let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel the weight of their decision, the way they had discarded him without hesitation but were now scrambling to make things right, not because they cared, but because they had been caught. He took a deep breath and finally spoke. I don't want my job back. Davenport's eyes widened. Wait, Jalen. I know how this works, Jalen cut in. If I come back, what's stopping the next person from getting fired the same way? You don't care about employees. You care about avoiding bad press. Calloway frowned. That's not fair. Jalen scoffed. Isn't it? He glanced at Officer Hayes. You said I could press charges. What happens if I do? Hayes folded his arms. Mrs. Wilkins knowingly filed a false police report. If you move forward, she'll be investigated. Depending on her history, she could be fined or even face legal consequences. Jalen thought for a moment. He didn't want to ruin anyone's life, but at the same time, why should people like her get away with this? What if Max's camera hadn't caught the truth? He'd still be unemployed, struggling to pay rent, while she went on with her life like nothing had happened. You should also know, Hayes continued, if this case gains attention, it could set a precedent. Companies like TrackDrop might have to change their policies when it comes to how they handle complaints. Jalen turned back to Calloway. Let me ask you something, he said, voice steady. What's stopping this from happening again? If another driver gets falsely accused, do they get a fair chance, or do they just get fired? Calloway shifted. We would review our procedures. Jalen shook his head. Not good enough. He turned to Davenport. You have security cameras. GPS logs. Delivery timestamps. Why don't you use them before making a decision? Davenport looked at Calloway, then back at Jalen. What do you want? Jalen exhaled. I want you to change your policy. No firing employees without verifiable proof. And I want an apology. A public one. Calloway's jaw clenched. That's a lot to ask. Jalen shrugged. You should have thought about that before you ruined my reputation. Calloway exchanged a glance with Davenport, then sighed. We'll discuss it. Jalen nodded. You do that. He turned to Hayes. As for pressing charges. I think I need to sleep on it. Officer Hayes smiled slightly. Fair enough. Max let out a small woof, as if approving of Jalen's stance. Jalen has taken a stand, but will TrackDrop actually follow through? And what will he decide about pressing charges? The office remained tense as Jalen and Officer Hayes left the room. Employees who had once avoided eye contact with Jalen now watched him with a mix of curiosity and guilt. A few had the decency to look embarrassed. As Jalen walked out, Damon, one of his former coworkers, hurried up beside him. Yo, man, he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I should have said something earlier. Jalen slowed but didn't stop walking. Why didn't you? Damon exhaled. Because this company doesn't like troublemakers. They make it real clear, speak up, and you're next. Jalen studied him. And now? Damon met his eyes. Now, they're scared. He motioned toward the break room, where a small group of employees were huddled, whispering. Nobody liked how they did you, Jay. People are talking. Some are saying if they don't change things, we should. He lowered his voice. Unionize. Jalen raised an eyebrow. Unionize? He hadn't expected that. Damon shrugged. They don't listen to one person, but they have to listen to all of us. Jalen nodded, impressed. Maybe his fight was sparking something bigger. Officer Hayes cleared his throat. Well, this just got interesting. Jalen smirked. No kidding. Just then, his phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. He answered. Hello. A hesitant voice came through. Is this Jalen Carter? Jalen frowned. Who's asking? This is Lisa Wilkins' son, Derek. Jalen exchanged a glance with Officer Hayes. Okay, and why are you calling me? Derek hesitated, then sighed. Because I saw the video. And I know my mom was lying. Jalen stiffened. Of all the things he expected, this wasn't one of them. Derek continued, voice uneasy. She does stuff like this a lot. Not always to this level, but I've seen it. She always gets away with it. He took a deep breath. I want to make it right. Jalen's grip on his phone tightened. And how exactly do you plan on doing that? Derek's response was firm. I'll testify if you press charges. Jalen glanced at Officer Hayes, who raised an eyebrow. Max let out a soft woof, almost as if he approved. Jalen now has a crucial witness, but will he take the next step and press charges? Jalen stared at his phone, processing Derek Wilkins' words. The son of the woman who nearly ruined his life was offering to help take her down. It was almost too much to believe. You'd really testify? Jalen asked. Derek sighed. Yeah. Look, I don't agree with what she did, and I'm tired of pretending it's okay. His voice lowered. She always talks about people knowing their place. She didn't just think you were suspicious, she thought she could get away with lying. And she almost did. Jalen glanced at Officer Hayes, who was watching him carefully. And why should I trust you? Derek didn't hesitate. Because I have proof. Jalen's heartbeat quickened. What kind of proof? Derek exhaled. Texts. She sent a message to one of her friends, bragging about how she handled the delivery guy. Said she had to teach him a lesson for not showing her the respect she deserved. His voice hardened. She doesn't even feel bad, man. Jalen's jaw clenched. He should have been furious, but at this point, was he even surprised? Officer Hayes nodded. If he has those messages, it's game over for her. A false police report was already bad, but if she's caught admitting it, that's intent. Jalen exhaled. So, what happens if I press charges? Hayes crossed his arms. She could face criminal charges, fines, maybe even jail time. At the very least, she'll be publicly exposed. No more getting away with it. Jalen stared at the floor, his mind racing. He wanted justice, but did he want to ruin her life? Then he thought about every time someone like her had done this to someone else. The ones who didn't get lucky, who never got their jobs back, who couldn't prove their innocence, who never had a K9 camera catching the truth. And he thought about the other TrackDrop drivers. The ones who were finally finding their voices. He looked at Hayes. "Let's do it." The officer nodded. "All right. I'll get the paperwork started." Derek spoke again. "Jalen?" "Yeah. Thanks for letting me do the right thing." Jalen's voice was steady. "Let's just make sure the right thing actually happens." Max wagged his tail, sensing the shift. The fight wasn't over yet, but now, Jalen had a real chance to win. With undeniable proof in hand, Jalen is ready to fight back. But how will Lisa Wilkins react when she realizes her lies are catching up to her? The courtroom was packed. Reporters whispered, cameras flashed, and murmurs filled the air as Jalen walked in, standing taller than ever. Lisa Wilkins sat across the room, looking tense. Gone was the arrogant woman who had smugly filed a complaint against him. Now, she avoided eye contact, gripping her lawyer's arm as if he could save her from what was coming. Jalen took his seat next to Officer Hayes, who leaned over. "Nervous?" Jalen exhaled. "Not even a little." The judge called the room to order. Lisa's lawyer tried to argue that the complaint was just a misunderstanding, but then Hayes stood up and played the footage from Max's camera. The entire courtroom watched as Lisa's accusations unraveled in real time. Then came the final blow, Derek's text message evidence. The judge read it out loud, had to teach him a lesson. "He'll think twice next time." Gasps filled the room. Lisa froze, her face turning pale. Jalen folded his arms. Next time, he thought. How many others had there been? The judge's voice was firm. "Lisa Wilkins, you are charged with filing a false police report, defamation, and obstruction of justice." Her lawyer tried to protest, but it was useless. The evidence was too strong. Then, the unexpected happened. A TrackDrop representative stood up. "Your Honor, TrackDrop would like to make a statement." Jalen narrowed his eyes as the rep turned to face him. "We publicly apologize to Jalen Carter for our failure to investigate before terminating his employment. Effective immediately, company policy will require verified evidence before any disciplinary action against employees." The courtroom stirred. It wasn't just about him anymore, this was change. Lisa Wilkins slumped in her chair as the judge finalized the charges against her. Meanwhile, Jalen finally felt free. Outside, reporters crowded around him, but he barely noticed. Max let out a proud bark, tail wagging. Jalen knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You really saved me, huh?" Max just licked his face. Officer Hayes laughed. "Looks like justice has a new best friend." Jalen smiled. For the first time in weeks, everything felt right. For more stories on K9 Dog helping people, click on Right playlist.